Hi, I want to give you a quick personal update and a brief discussion about perspective in the Old Testament. To learn more, join me for today's episode of All Things Apostolic. For those of you who happen to follow All Things Apostolic and watch or listen to my weekly episodes, I am so grateful for your viewership and listenership. Each of my episodes can sometimes take 8 hours or more to develop, and it's because of you that it's worth it. Some of you may remember that I'm working on a doctorate degree in biblical studies. Biblical studies is a specific academic field, and it's pretty intense. It does involve some theology, but it mostly entails examining the historical, literary, and cultural context of the books of the Bible. It involves methods of interpretation, as well as studying the Bible in the original languages of Greek and Hebrew. The goal is to understand the meaning or meanings of the text to the original audience, and then also to determine appropriate applications of the text today for the benefit of the church. And that's one of the reasons why I've really enjoyed being involved in All Things Apostolic. It provides me with an outlet for sharing some of the things that I've been learning or things related to the Bible that I'm interested in. I really feel like God has called me to do this degree program, and I hope that I can be a blessing to you and others with all of the information that I'm learning. I've been in my doctoral program now for about 7.5 years. It's a slow pace. I've completed 14 courses and I've passed proficiency exams in Greek, Hebrew, and German. It does not mean I'm an expert in any of those languages, but I'm proficient enough to use them for biblical study. I am to the point where I'm taking my comprehensive exam, which entails passing written tests for 13 out of my 14 courses. The exam is divided into 3 parts. There is a 3-hour test for 3 courses, a 3-hour test for 3 more courses, and a 6-hour test for 7 courses. And I don't know what the questions are ahead of time, so I have to review as much material as possible that I think might be on the test. And it really is almost overwhelming. So I've been preparing, and I took my first exam last week. I don't know the results yet, but I'm positive, unfortunately, I'll have to take one of them again. And it's common not to pass all of them. It's pass-fail, but it's common not to pass all of the parts of the exams because you may get hit with a question you didn't study well enough or study at all. I have heard horror stories from my professors about sitting down to complete their comps and seeing questions that they hadn't studied for. So it's like a rite of passage to go through this torturous process. If I can stay on track, I'll be taking my next exam next week and then the 3rd exam in late June, and then I'll sit down to test a 4th time in early July to retake any of the sections that I didn't pass. So please pray for me. My brain is old and not nearly as nimble as it was even when I began the program over 7 years ago. And timed testing is one of my least favorite things to do. In fact, I hope this is the last time I will ever take timed tests for the rest of my life because it is grueling. But I know that what I'm doing is what God wants me to do. And once I get past this testing window, then I'll go on to the dissertation phase, which will probably take about 1.5 years. And it will be very intense as well, but in a different way. And I think and hope much better because it won't involve memorization of huge amounts of information. And hopefully, I'll be researching a topic that really interests me. So, that's my update. And all that to say, between now and mid-July, my episodes for All Things Apostolic will be sporadic at best. In the weeks when I'm testing, I won't be able to record. In the other weeks, I will squeeze in an episode whenever I can, but they won't be as extensive as I normally do because right now, my schooling has to be the priority over everything else or I won't pass my exams. Thank you so much for your understanding and your prayers. And I can't wait for things to get back to normal in mid-July. The other topic I want to briefly cover today is something that I came across in my studies for my biblical theology course. It is a really simple thought, but sometimes the simple thoughts can be profound. The Old Testament does not present itself as Israel's reflection on God. The Old Testament presents itself from the very beginning, from the perspective of God. We think of the Old Testament as a history of creation and the primitive world, and then the history of Israel, beginning with Abraham and through the growth of a family and into a nation. It was written by Jewish writers inspired by God over a long period of time. And we think of it as not only their perspective about their history, but their perspective about their God. But is that the real perspective or the only perspective? Let's look at a few brief examples. In Genesis chapter 1, we read about the story of creation. Moses wrote it, but is it Moses' perspective of creation or is it God's? Moses wrote about Adam and Eve and the fall, but we see God's perspective about their actions and his response in which he imposed judgment and mercy. What about the flood? God saw the wickedness. All flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. The Lord decided to destroy mankind, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. The instructions for the ark came from God. The animals were miraculously sent by God. The flood came from God. And after the flood, it was God who made the covenant with Noah. And we see God's viewpoint on all of these activities. In Genesis chapter 11, the people were building the tower to reach into the heavens. It was the Lord who observed what they were doing and decided to confound their language and scatter them. It was God who called Abraham, made a covenant with him, renamed him, and gave him promises. The Exodus was from God's perspective. He approached Moses and commissioned him. He performed all of the miracles. He was aware of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. He gave the instructions for the Exodus. He saved Israel at the Red Sea and destroyed Pharaoh's troops. God met them at Sinai and formed Israel into a nation with a covenant of law. He gave Israel the promised land, but the spies didn't see it through God's eyes. So he required the disobedient and faithless generation to die in the wilderness. God gave them judges, but the people continually disobeyed. When the people wanted a king like the other nations, God said it was a rejection of him, and he gave them what they asked for, a king like the other nations. We read of God's perspective about choosing David, helping him conquer enemies, and becoming a great king. And when David sinned, we saw David sin through God's eyes. During the time of the monarchy and the divided kingdom, God spoke directly to his people through the prophets, so they would very clearly understand God's expectations. The phrase, "Thus saith the Lord," occurs 415 times in the Old Testament. It was God who allowed foreign nations to rise up and conquer Israel, to wake her up from her spiritual apostasy. The book of Job provides God's view of what happened to Job. The book of Proverbs is God's wisdom. Now, one book that may be an exception is Psalms, because many of the Psalms are human reflections about God. But for the most part, the Old Testament is from God's perspective. The Old Testament is really about God's actions throughout history. And when events happened in the Bible, we learn about God's viewpoint of them. What does He think about them? How does He feel about them? What does He say? What does He do? So the next time you're reading from the Old Testament, see how much of the content is told from God's perspective. And that makes sense because the Bible is really relational. It's about us getting to know who God is. It's His Word. He speaks to us through His Word, and He reveals Himself to us through His Word. So I think it's an insightful point that the Old Testament is not Israel's reflection about God, but it presents itself from the perspective of God. Thank you for joining me for today's episode of All Things Apostolic. And until next time, take care and God bless.